For starters, we started with our, on this side of the lungs here, we have our azygous vein, along with our intercostal arteries and veins going between each rib. Okay, so the azygous vein here on the back with the intercostal arteries and veins.
You guys should just share videos.
Yeah.
It's like no one trusts anyone to like share.
Okay. Are putting these up at all?
I have been, but
Okay.
mine have all been getting cut off because my phone deleted everything, and then it started like halfway through last time. So
Okay, on the back side here is the dorsal aorta, right, coming off of the aortic arch, which we reviewed yesterday. Also has the intercostal arteries coming off of it. So now we're just past the diaphragm here, and the dorsal aorta runs all the way down here until it splits into the external iliacs down here. Okay, so there's some main branches that we're going to follow. So going more medially here, we have the celiac artery, the cranial mesenteric artery, and then we go further down and we have the caudal mesenteric artery. Okay, coming more laterally, we also have some important branches. To orient yourself, this is the kidney, and this smaller little bean-shaped gland here is the adrenal gland. So you have an artery and vein running underneath the adrenal gland, that's the adrenolumbar artery and vein, going to what's called the hilus of the kidney. Here is the renal artery and vein. Okay, also I think you guys already know this, but this is our posterior vena cava, the long main vein that runs parallel to the dorsal aorta. Okay, so coming down here, we've got adrenal lumbar artery, renal artery, and if you have a female, this will be your ovarian artery. If you have a male, it'll be your spermatic artery and vein. Then down here, you have your deep ileal circumflex artery and vein. Again, this is way down here around the ilium of the hip. Remember, we had ilium, ischium, and pubis, so the ilium is like the wing-shaped one that comes up. So that's why this is deep ileal circumflex. So you have deep ileal circumflex, ovarian or spermatic if you have a male, renal, and adrenal lumbar. There's also one tiny little one right here called the posterior phrenic. Okay, so the adrenal lumbar and the renal both run parallel to each other and perpendicular to the dorsal aorta, but the posterior phrenic runs parallel to the dorsal aorta here and perpendicular to the adrenal lumbar here, and actually runs underneath it. Okay, so that little guy's posterior phrenic. Okay, so now we're going to jump to following the branches of the three main medial ones. So we have the celiac artery here, and the cranial mesenteric artery here, caudal mesenteric here. So the celiac artery branches off. Its first branch is the hepatic, going up towards the liver. Then it has gastric and left gastric, which branch off together towards the stomach. There's a few different varieties of branching patterns here, but also know that the gastric artery splits into this complex of arteries on the lesser curvature of the stomach that are just gastric arteries as well. So the one that goes over to that side is the gastric artery, and the left gastric is the one that stays over here on the left, or like the behind side, the back side of the stomach. Okay, and I think your book is a little backwards on the way that it describes that, so probably not gonna ask you more than just identifying that this is gastric branching off. Okay, after the two gastric arteries branch off, the celiac is now called the splenic artery in this section. Okay, and that branches into anterior splenic and posterior splenic. So remember, this is our large spleen here. So we have anterior splenic, posterior splenic, splenic artery, the left gastric arteries, and then celiac down here. So I'm going to jump back to this hepatic artery that went to the liver. It has three branches. So it basically terminates in like a three-way split. Okay, so the hepatic artery comes up here. It splits into one here called the gastroduodenal that goes to the very beginning of the duodenum and the end of the stomach, right around the pyloric sphincter area. So that's the gastroduodenal artery. There's other branches of the gastroduodenal, including a gastroepiploic, a pyloric, and an anterior pancreaticoduodenal, but we're not going to do any of those other than the anterior pancreaticoduodenal. We're going to follow it from the other side, okay? So from this side, I just want you to know gastroduodenal, so when you're at home reviewing, and know that I'll be adding those further branches of gastroduodenal to the board of the list of figures you don't need to know. So hepatic artery comes up here, then gastroduodenal, then it has one right here that goes to the gallbladder. Remember, the gallbladder is like the greenish little squishy organ between these two lobes of the liver. So that is your cystic artery. And then it has this one here that goes over to the left side of the liver called the branch of hepatic. So your hepatic artery comes up, splits into gastroduodenal, cystic, going to the gallbladder, and branch of hepatic here. Everyone got that? Okay, so that's our celiac artery and all of its branches. Now we're going to go to our cranial mesenteric artery here. Okay. So this, to orient you, this is the descending colon, this is our transverse colon. Remember, this is the cecum, the blind end of the large intestine, and our short little ascending colon. So this is cranial mesenteric artery, and this is caudal mesenteric artery. I think I'll actually do caudal mesenteric first. So the caudal mesenteric artery branches over to the descending colon. The branch that goes down towards the rectum here is called the cranial hemorrhoidal artery. So since it goes to like the rectum area, you can associate like the hemorrhoidal part of that name. The cranial might not seem to make much sense, but this is cranial hemorrhoidal artery. The anterior branch going up here is the left colic. Now remember, the descending colon lays on the left side of the body, so that's why it's called left colic artery and vein here. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our cranial mesenteric artery. The left colic artery in this specific cat is different than most. It goes directly into the cranial mesenteric, but imagine that it's actually feeding into this middle colic here, because that's how it is on most cats. Okay, so if I'm following my cranial mesenteric artery here, the first branch is typically the middle colic right here, which if you flip that over, goes to the transverse colon. So middle colic makes sense, it goes to the transverse colon. And then the left colic typically branches off of the middle colic and goes down the descending colic. Okay, then the cranial mesenteric artery, right, has the middle colic artery coming off, and the next branch is the ileocolic, so that's this one. So remember, we have our ileocecal valve here where the ileum meets the cecum, or the blind end of the large intestine here. So this artery going to that valve is the ileocecal artery, whereas the branch going to the transverse colon is the middle colic. Okay, then the branch going to the small intestines here is just called the intestinal artery. Now if you spread apart these small intestines, you may remember that this was just called the mesentery when we did the digestive system. All of these arteries and veins are just called intestinal arteries and veins, right? So they all branch from this one main intestinal artery and vein. So far we have the cranial mesenteric artery that splits into middle colic artery, ileocecal artery, and an intestinal artery. And we have one more branch of that that goes over here towards the duodenum. So if we orient ourselves, this is our duodenum coming down here with the pancreas coming down along that as well. And the posterior pancreaticoduodenal artery branches over onto the duodenum and pancreas here. So your anterior mesenteric artery has branches including the posterior pancreaticoduodenal artery, the intestinal artery, the ileocecal artery, and the middle colic artery, which then typically turns into the left colic artery as you go down the descending colon. Okay, remember that anterior pancreaticoduodenal artery I was talking to you guys about before? It was a branch of the gastroduodenal from the other side. So that is up here. So remember, this is posterior pancreaticoduodenal artery here, and the anterior pancreaticoduodenal. You have to scrape away the pancreatic tissue up here at the very beginning of the duodenum, but that there is the anterior pancreaticoduodenal artery, and it connects over to the gastroduodenal, but I'm not going to make you find that connection. This is kind of challenging. All right, that's all. Any questions?